from Matthew 8, verses 5 to 13. When Jesus returned to Capernaum, a Roman officer came and pleaded with him. "Lord, my young servant lies in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain." Jesus said, "I will come and heal him." But the officer said, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come into my home. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have the authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, 'Go,' and they go, or 'Come,' and they come. And if I say to my slaves, 'Do this,' they do it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to those who were following him, he said, "I tell you the truth, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel. And I tell you this, that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. But many Israelites, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the Roman officer, "Go back home, because you believed. It has happened." And the young servant was healed that same hour.
The situation we're currently in with COVID-19 and with everything else that's going on in the world has been described as the us versus them pandemic. And I think that's a fitting title. The world seems particularly divided at the moment. There seems to be a lot of argument, a lot of tensions. And now that can seem like a new thing, and it's certainly been heightened by the nature of social media and instantaneous delivery of news from all over the world and delivery of opinions from all over the world. And it can feel quite overwhelming. But actually, it's not a new thing. Human nature has been driven by this categorizing forever, and sometimes it's a useful thing. It's a good way to learn to categorize things. We know what's food, we know what's useful for clothing, and we developed so many different categories that help us to learn about new things. But in terms of people, it can be really unhelpful. It can lead to bigotry and discrimination. But as I said, it's certainly not new. So in the passage that Andrew read for us, we heard about Jesus meeting a Roman centurion. For the whole time that Jesus was on the earth, Israel, where he lived, was not an independent nation. Despite its rich and complex independent history and culture, it was an occupied territory. It belonged entirely to the Roman Empire. Which means that when Jesus met this man, he was not just a Gentile, that is to say someone who's not Jewish. He was also a representative of the occupying force. And yet that's not how Jesus sees him in the story. Jesus sees him as someone needing his help, and his first response is immediately to offer. He says, "I will come and heal him." Despite the fact that as a Jewish teacher, Jesus was expected not to go into a Gentile's home. In fact, it would have been considered he would have been considered unclean had he done so. And we see that the Roman officer knows this, because he says, "No, I'm not worthy for you to come into my home." And then incredibly, he explains that it's not an issue. He says, "But you've got authority, and I know how that works. I can tell my servants to go, and they go. I don't need to do it myself. And so you don't need to go. You can say from here, and he'll be healed." And this was incredible, and Jesus did it. He healed him, and that's amazing that Jesus healed him from that distance. But it's also amazing that this centurion came to this conclusion not having grown up in Israel, not having grown up learning the scriptures, not having grown up learning about God's power in the way that the Israelites would have. And Jesus recognizes how incredible this is, and he says, "This is amazing faith. I've not seen faith like this in all of Israel." Jesus is not at all fussed by the outsider status of the centurion. In fact, he goes on to challenge the insiders, the Israelites who've grown up expecting the kingdom of heaven as their inheritance. He says to them, it's not automatic. In fact, many of you aren't going to be getting in. He completely turns the insider-outsider idea on its head. And I find that really amazing, but also quite challenging. I like to think that I'm a fairly inclusive person, a fairly not bigoted, not discriminatory person. But actually, I realise that we all categorise people and ideas and things, and And one area in which I think I've subtly let this happen in my life is that growing up in the church, I've taken all of these positive Bible messages and I've gone, that's awesome, and it's for us, it's a Christian thing, and it's good, but it's all about Christians. So for example, when the Bible says that we're made in the image of God, I take that to mean Christians are made in the image of God. But that's not actually what the scriptures say. What it says in the Bible is, God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So God created human beings, all of us, every single one, in his own image. Male and female, Christian, atheist, everybody. And yet, for my whole life, I've kind of gone, yeah, Christians are the children of God, we're made in his image, awesome. But actually, pausing and really looking at what the scripture says here, every single person, whether we like them or not, whether they're in our group or out of our group, is a reflection of the living God. And they've been given part of his authority and responsibility over the world. And that means that we need to look at them the way that God does. We need to look at them as a reflection of him, and we need to see them for the good they can bring. In the book of James, it says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Absolutely everything good is from God, not just those things that have a Christian label or come from inside the church or come from people that we see as good and in our in-group. Everything good comes from God. Or as a good friend of mine puts it, good news is good news wherever you find it. And that's what happened with Jesus and the centurion. He recognised the centurion's faith as a gift from God and he celebrated it as such. And he didn't let anything else stand in the way. And actually, I find this incredibly freeing to be reminded that God's goodness can be displayed in different people and in different ways, and that actually the church is not God's only avenue for working in the world. Growing up and attending 90s Christian youth groups, I very much took away a picture of the church as the last hope of the gospel, and that evangelism was our responsibility, and the only way anybody would be saved was by us fully explaining to them everything they needed to know about the gospel. And I was terrified by that. I did not feel qualified, competent, intelligent enough to take this huge and complex God, understand him and explain his love, and to do that all to people who had no encounters with him, no understanding of him. Nothing. That was a terrifying idea, particularly as a teenager who was just figuring this stuff out myself. But pausing and realising that God's already there, that these people who may not know him by name already share some of his characteristics, that he is already present in their lives and he's already at work, changes that. So evangelism goes from carrying this burden of this huge God who we can't carry to places where he's not, into the reality of actually going to places where he's already at work and watching for him, seeing his goodness in the people already there, and just helping them to see where that comes from, introducing them to the one who gives them that goodness in the first place. And we see that this is exactly what Paul does. So in Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens and he is disgusted and horrified by the idol worship he sees there. But instead of getting angry and shouting at them all, or just walking on to another town and going, this is a write-off, those people aren't going to get it, he pauses and he finds a way to talk to them. He finds an altar that is marked to the unknown God, and he uses that to teach them the gospel. He says, and to teach them about the God who they don't know, but who knows them and has made them in his image. And he says to them, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. In him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. We can see here that Paul clearly wasn't afraid of listening to Gentile speakers and reading Gentile literature. And in fact, he used it to reveal God to them. And that doesn't mean to say that everything that everyone says and everything that everyone does or writes is good and equally true and valid. That's clearly not the case. We're very imperfect beings. And we don't fully reflect God's character with everything that we do. So how do we strike the balance? How do we see God's image in others and see his goodness in the things that they say and do? How do we, like Jesus, know when to praise a complete stranger, an outsider, for revealing God through their faith, but also know when to turn around to one of our best friends and say, Satan, get behind me, because they're not revealing God in what they're doing and saying? How do we gain an understanding of what is good in what we read and see without just limiting it to a filter of only the stuff that's got a Christian label or come from the church, and also at the same time without opening up to everything ever being just as equally good and valid? Learning the way that Paul did to see God's goodness in and amongst secular contexts and content. And before we get to that, we need to address Jesus' stark warning to the insiders in the passage. He said, "But many Israelites, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." That's quite a harsh warning. So we need to look at it. Why did these Israelites, who had the kingdom of heaven prepared for them, not get in? What kept them out from the kingdom of heaven, and what do we need to do differently to them? Well, the Israelites believed that they were due a place in the kingdom of heaven because of their heritage, because they could trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham, and because they had the traditions and the laws and they followed them. They felt that they had earned a place, but this isn't enough. We're not good enough to get in based on our ability. All humanity, despite being made in the image of God, is broken. We get things wrong. We're not perfect. But luckily we see that actually isn't what we need. We don't need to be perfect. We don't need to have a perfect record going back through the generations. All we need is what the centurion had: faith. We see that when Jesus was dealing with the centurion, he didn't stop and check, who are your parents? Did you learn the scriptures as you grew up? He saw his faith and he praised it. And that's because faith is what saves us. Not our status, but faith in Jesus. We need to believe that he has saved us, and we need to rely on that and nothing else as our salvation. As it says in Ephesians, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from ourselves. It is the gift of God." So we have to make sure not to let any ideas of our own, of earning our own salvation, sneak in. Not to allow the idea of being a good Christian, going to the right church, listening to the right worship music, growing up in a good Christian home, any of these things become for us some kind of earning of our salvation. We have to rely purely on God's grace, which is the best news, because none of us would make it otherwise. Now, going back to the previous question, how do we see God's character and his image in those around us? How do we spot his goodness in the world? We need to start off by looking at the one person who is exactly God's image, with nothing else getting in the way. The one person who the author of Hebrews describes as the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. And that's Jesus. We need to spend our time getting to know him, And one of the best ways we can do this is by spending time reading the Bible, exploring encounters like the one we've heard about today, and seeing how he lives, how he acts, and trying our best to emulate that. And I think the other thing we can do is, when we're faced with all of this bad news and just being overwhelmed by hearing so many unpleasant and horrible things and feeling that we've got to join an us or an them in every argument, feeling that we've got a decision of either hiding away from the world and just pretending none of this is happening, or fully getting involved in all of the misery and the argument and feeling that we have to let it overwhelm us. Instead of either of those options, we see a brilliant choice that's presented to us by Paul, and I think it's a great way for us to choose to react to the world right now, which is, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things.